At exactly 8:42 a.m., on a quiet street just outside a luxury high-rise in Westchester County, a splash of muddy water struck a young cleaner named Emma Carter so hard it stole the breath from her chest. And for a moment she didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there soaked in silence as a woman in a white SUV laughed and drove away like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just humiliated someone who couldn't afford to fight back. And across the street, behind the tinted glass of a black sedan, a man named Ethan Cole watched every second of it. Not with shock, not with anger, but with a kind of stillness that comes from power, the kind of power that doesn't react, it decides. That morning wasn't supposed to matter. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than another rushed commute, another gray morning after a night of rain. But for Emma, it was the kind of moment that stays with you long after your clothes dry, the kind that reminds you exactly where you stand in a world that rarely slows down for people like her. And for Vanessa Whitmore, the woman behind the wheel, it was just another careless act in a life where consequences had always been optional, or money smoothed over mistakes before they could ever catch up, and for years, that had worked. But what Vanessa didn't see, what she couldn't have known, was that the man sitting quietly across the street wasn't just a witness. He was already connected to her world in ways she didn't fully understand, a private investor with influence that stretched far beyond the surface, a man who had spent years building companies, dismantling others, and deciding who stayed in power and who didn't. And in that brief, unguarded moment, he saw something he hadn't expected, not just cruelty, but character, and sometimes that's all it takes. Because this story isn't about a splash of mud. It's about what happens when the wrong person underestimates the wrong moment. When someone used to being ignored is suddenly seen by someone who doesn't ignore anything. And how a single act, dismissed in seconds, can quietly set something much larger into motion, something that doesn't announce itself, doesn't warn you, but moves with precision until everything changes. But the real story isn't the splash, it's what happened after. It's how a man who had everything became interested in someone who had almost nothing, how a woman who believed she was untouchable slowly realized she wasn't, and how power, when it finally shifts, rarely makes noise until it's too late to stop it. So before we go any further, let us know where and what time you're watching from in the comments. Because by the time this story reaches its end, you may find yourself wondering how much can really change in a single moment. Who was the man sitting behind that dark glass, watching a moment most people would forget before the light changed? And why did something so small hold his attention long after the street had emptied and the sound of that engine had faded? Why would a man like Ethan Cole, known in quiet circles for making decisions that reshaped entire companies, care about a stranger who had just been humiliated on a wet morning? And more importantly, what did he see in that moment that no one else did? Because what followed wasn't immediate. It didn't unfold in anger or impulse. It moved slowly, deliberately, the way power often does when it knows exactly what it's doing. And within days, conversations began behind closed doors, numbers shifted in places most people never look, and pressure built in ways that didn't make headlines until it was already too late to stop, until the first reports started to surface, until people inside Vanessa Whitmore's company began to notice that something wasn't right. Questions started being asked at the top. Meetings that were once routine became tense. And then came the headline no one in her position ever expects to see. CEO forced out overnight. A single line that erased years of control in a matter of hours. And while the public searched for answers, while analysts tried to explain what had happened, very few connected it back to a quiet street, to a passing moment, to a choice that seemed too small to matter. And somewhere far from that boardroom, Emma Carter's life had already begun to change in ways she couldn't yet explain. Doors opening where there had only been walls, opportunities appearing where there had only been routine, and she didn't know why, not yet. But she would soon realize that someone had been paying attention, someone who had seen her at her lowest and remembered it. And the most unexpected part of all of this, the part no one could have predicted, wasn't just the fall of someone who believed she was beyond consequences. It was what grew in its place. Because Ethan Cole didn't just decide to act. He didn't just move pieces behind the scenes, somewhere along the way, in a way that surprised even him. He became invested in something far more personal, something that had nothing to do with power or strategy. He didn't just seek justice, he fell in love. Emma Carter wasn't invisible, not really. But life had taught her how to move through the world without expecting to be noticed, how to keep her head down, her voice steady, and her focus fixed on what mattered most: getting through the day, getting to the next shift, getting back home to the one person who depended on her more than anyone else, her younger brother, Daniel, who was still in school, still too young to understand just how much she carried on her own. And every decision Emma made, every hour she worked, every opportunity she passed up, was shaped by one simple responsibility: making sure he had a chance at something better. She woke up before sunrise most days, long before the streets filled with traffic, long before the city felt alive, preparing for work in a small apartment that barely held the two of them, stretching every dollar, planning every expense, never complaining, never asking for more than what she had earned. And while others around her talked about dreams and future plans, Emma focused on what was in front of her: the next shift, the next paycheck, the next bill that needed to be paid. And there was a kind of discipline in that, a quiet strength that didn't demand attention but held everything together. She didn't see herself as someone who needed saving, and she didn't wait for anyone to step in, because experience had already taught her that most people wouldn't. And that morning, standing there soaked and humiliated, she felt the weight of that truth again, not as anger, not even as sadness, but as something heavier, something more familiar: the understanding that sometimes you just keep moving, because stopping isn't an option. Vanessa Whitmore, on the other hand, had built a life where stopping was never necessary, where obstacles were handled before they could slow her down, where control wasn't just a habit, it was the foundation of everything she had created. As the CEO of Whitmore & Company, a fast-rising fashion brand known for its luxury image and carefully curated identity, she had spent years shaping not just products, but perception, deciding how people saw her company, how they saw her, and more importantly, how much influence she held in rooms most people never entered. She was known for her precision, her attention to detail, and her unwillingness to tolerate mistakes, whether they came from employees, partners, or anyone who stepped into her world. And over time, that reputation had turned into something stronger than respect. It became authority, the kind that doesn't need to be explained because it's already understood. And in her mind, moments like the one on that street didn't carry weight, they didn't linger, they didn't matter, because they never had before. But what Vanessa didn't account for was the kind of attention she couldn't control, the kind that didn't announce itself, didn't seek approval, and didn't operate within the boundaries she was used to managing. Because while she was focused on maintaining her image, someone else had already started looking beyond it. Ethan Cole had built his reputation in a different world, one that rarely made headlines but shaped the outcomes people eventually read about. A private investor with a track record of identifying weaknesses long before they became visible, of stepping into companies quietly and leaving them completely changed, sometimes stronger, sometimes dismantled, depending on what he decided they were worth. He wasn't known for reacting. He wasn't driven by impulse, and he didn't make decisions based on emotion. Every move he made was calculated, measured against risk, timing, and outcome. And when he turned his attention to something, it was never by accident. It was because he had already seen something others hadn't. In the weeks leading up to that morning, Ethan had been studying Vanessa Whitmore's company closely, reviewing financial patterns, observing leadership decisions, listening to conversations that revealed more than they intended to. And while everything on the surface looked controlled, stable, even successful, there were signs beneath it that told a different story: subtle inconsistencies, pressure points that hadn't been exposed yet, but were there if you knew where to look. That was why he was there that morning, not by coincidence, not by chance, but because his attention had already been fixed on Vanessa's world. And yet, what he witnessed on that street had nothing to do with balance sheets or boardroom strategy. It was something far simpler, far more revealing, a moment that showed him not how her company operated, but how she did. And sometimes, that tells you more than any report ever could. He had been watching Vanessa for weeks, but not for the reasons anyone expected. And after that morning, his interest in her company was no longer just about business. The rain had stopped just minutes earlier, but the street still carried the weight of it. Puddles stretched along the curb, thin reflections of buildings trembling with every passing car. And Emma Carter moved carefully along the edge of the sidewalk, her eyes fixed downward, calculating each step the way she always did on mornings like this. One wrong move could mean soaked shoes, a ruined uniform. Another problem, she didn't have time to fix. And she was already running late. Her shift had started 10 minutes ago, and every second mattered. A few cars passed without slowing, tires cutting through shallow water, spraying just enough to make people step back. But nothing unusual, nothing that demanded attention. Just another gray morning in a city that rarely paused for anyone. And across the street, Ethan Cole remained in his car, watching the flow of movement with the same quiet focus he brought to everything. Not searching for anything specific, just observing. The way he always did. Then, in the distance, a white SUV turned the corner faster than it should have, its tires slicing through a deeper section of water near the curb. And for a brief second, everything aligned: Emma's position, the speed of the vehicle, the angle of the road. And then it happened. The impact sudden and complete, a heavy wave of muddy water rising and crashing directly into her, soaking her from the shoulders down, forcing her to stop mid-step as the world around her seemed to pause. For a moment, there was no movement, no reaction, just the sound of water dripping from fabric onto concrete, the quiet rhythm of it filling the space where something should have been said. And Emma stood there, her hands slightly raised, her breath caught somewhere between shock and restraint, as if reacting too quickly might somehow make it worse. People nearby noticed. A couple standing near the entrance of the building turned immediately, their expressions shifting from surprise to something less defined. A passing pedestrian slowed just enough to look, then kept walking, and further down the sidewalk, someone let out a short laugh, not loud enough to draw attention, but enough to be heard, enough to linger. And still, no one stepped forward, no one spoke, no one offered anything that might have broken the moment. The SUV slowed just ahead, then stopped, and for a second, it seemed like the driver might continue on, like this would end the same way most moments like this do. Unacknowledged, forgotten. But then the driver's window lowered halfway, and Vanessa Whitmore leaned slightly toward the opening, her expression calm, almost amused, as she looked directly at Emma. Maybe next time, stand somewhere cleaner. Her tone was light, dismissive, as if the situation required nothing more than a passing comment. And without waiting for a response, without giving the moment any more weight than she already had, she raised the window and pressed the accelerator, the SUV pulling away smoothly, disappearing into traffic as if nothing had happened at all. Emma didn't follow, didn't call out, didn't react in any way that would draw attention back to her. She simply lowered her hand slowly, her eyes dropping again to the ground, not out of shame, but out of control, the kind that comes from knowing there's nothing to gain by responding. And after a few seconds, she stepped forward, continuing toward the building as if the only thing that mattered now was not being any later than she already was. Across the street, Ethan Cole remained exactly where he was, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged. He didn't reach for the door, didn't make a call, didn't signal to anyone. He simply watched the entire sequence unfold from beginning to end, absorbing every detail, the timing, the reaction, the absence of reaction, and the person at the center of it all. He didn't speak, and from the outside, it would have seemed like nothing about that moment affected him at all. But something had shifted, not in a way that could be seen, not in a way that announced itself, but in the quiet, deliberate way decisions begin long before they are ever acted on. Because Ethan didn't believe in accidents, not the kind that revealed more than they concealed. And what he had just witnessed wasn't just a mistake, it was a glimpse into something deeper, something that, in his world, always came with consequences. Emma Carter didn't stop to process what had happened. She walked straight into the service entrance of the building, water still dripping from her clothes, her shoes leaving faint marks across the polished floor as she made her way toward the storage room. And by the time she reached it, her uniform clung to her in a way that made movement uncomfortable. But she didn't hesitate, didn't pause. She grabbed a dry cloth, wiped her face, adjusted what she could, and stepped back out to begin her shift like nothing had happened. It didn't go unnoticed for long. Her supervisor caught sight of her within minutes, his expression tightening as he took in her appearance, the wet fabric, the visible stains, the disruption to the image the building tried to maintain. And without asking what had happened, without giving her space to explain, he spoke in a tone that was more about standards than understanding, reminding her that presentation mattered, that tenants noticed details, that this wasn't acceptable. And Emma stood there, listening without interruption, without defense, nodding once before returning to her work, because arguing wouldn't change anything, and losing time would only make things worse. She moved through the rest of the morning with the same steady focus she always carried, cleaning offices, emptying bins, restoring order in spaces that were never meant to reflect the effort behind them. And while the discomfort stayed with her, while the memory of that moment lingered in the back of her mind, she didn't let it slow her down, because she had already learned that resilience wasn't about reacting. It was about continuing, even when no one was watching. But someone had been watching, and unlike everyone else who had moved on, Ethan Cole hadn't dismissed what he saw. By the time the morning traffic had settled, he was already making calls, his voice calm, precise, giving instructions that didn't require explanation, asking for information that wasn't publicly available, and within minutes, his assistant began pulling records, financial reports, internal communications, anything connected to Vanessa Whitmore and the company she controlled. By noon that same day, Ethan wasn't guessing anymore. He wasn't relying on impressions or assumptions. He had data, patterns, timelines that told a clearer story than anything visible from the outside. Whitmore and Company had grown aggressively over the past 2 years, expanding into new markets, increasing production, pushing its brand into spaces that demanded constant capital. And while the public saw success, the numbers revealed strain, debt levels rising faster than revenue, operational costs, tightening margins, and decisions being made at the top that prioritized image over stability. There were signs of pressure that hadn't reached the surface yet, investor concerns that had been quiet but consistent, board members who were beginning to question direction, partners who were committed but cautious, and in a company built so heavily on perception, those kinds of weaknesses didn't stay hidden forever. They waited for the right moment, the right pressure point, and then they shifted everything. Ethan reviewed it all without urgency, because urgency wasn't how he operated. He looked for leverage, for timing, for the exact place where influence could move something larger than itself. And what he saw wasn't just a company with potential. It was a company exposed in ways its leadership hadn't fully recognized. A structure that looked strong from a distance, but carried enough imbalance to be redirected by someone who understood where to apply pressure. And Vanessa Whitmore, moving through her day as usual, managing meetings, approving decisions, maintaining control over the world she had built, had no indication that anything had changed, no sense that a moment she had already forgotten had placed her directly in the path of someone who didn't forget anything, someone who had already begun to act. Because by the time the day reached its midpoint, this was no longer about what had happened on that street. It had moved into a different space entirely, one defined by strategy, timing, and quiet decisions that rarely revealed themselves until the outcome was already in motion. And without realizing it, without seeing it coming, Vanessa had done more than dismiss a stranger that morning. She had made herself a target. Ethan Cole didn't move quickly. He moved precisely, and over the next several days, his presence began to take shape in places that rarely drew attention. Small acquisitions at first, shares purchased through intermediaries, positions built quietly without triggering concern, each move calculated to avoid noise, to remain beneath the threshold that would alert Vanessa Whitmore or anyone watching closely. And at the same time, conversations began to shift behind closed doors. Board members who had once been aligned started reconsidering their position, not because they were told to, but because the right questions were finally being asked. He didn't pressure anyone directly. He didn't need to. He simply introduced clarity, data that highlighted risks, projections that exposed vulnerabilities, and slowly, the confidence that had once surrounded Vanessa's leadership began to weaken, not publicly, not yet, but internally, where decisions are shaped long before they are announced, and where influence matters more than appearances. And as those conversations spread, so did uncertainty. At the same time, Ethan did something that had nothing to do with strategy, nothing to do with numbers or leverage. He went back to the building where he had first seen Emma Carter, not as an investor, not as someone with authority, but as a man who wanted to understand something he hadn't been able to ignore. And when he saw her again, moving through the same routine, focused, composed, unchanged by the attention she didn't know she had received, he didn't interrupt her work. He didn't make a scene. He simply spoke to her briefly, asking a question that had nothing to do with that morning, and she answered the way she always did, direct, respectful, without expectation. There was no recognition on her side, no awareness of who he was or what he had already set in motion. And that was part of what held his attention, because what he had seen in her wasn't performance. It wasn't something shaped for an audience. It was consistent, the same quiet discipline, the same refusal to let circumstances define her behavior. And what started as curiosity, something he could have dismissed, something that should have remained separate from everything else he was doing, slowly became something more difficult to categorize, something that didn't fit into the frameworks he usually relied on. Meanwhile, inside Whitmore and Company, the environment had begun to change in ways Vanessa couldn't fully control. Questions from investors became more direct. Meetings that once moved smoothly started to carry tension, and decisions that would have been approved without hesitation were now being reviewed more carefully. And although nothing had been said openly, the shift was there, subtle but growing, like pressure building beneath a surface that still appeared intact. Vanessa responded the way she always had, tightening control, reinforcing expectations, pushing harder to maintain the image she had built. But this time, the resistance didn't settle, it expanded, because the concerns were no longer isolated. They were connected, and the more she tried to stabilize the situation, the more it revealed just how fragile certain parts of it had become. Ethan watched this unfold without interference, allowing each piece to move into place, because timing mattered, and acting too early would only weaken the outcome. And by the end of the second week, the momentum had reached a point where it could no longer be contained within private discussions, the kind of moment where everything shifts from quiet consideration to formal action. And then, without warning, without preparation, the board called an emergency meeting. The meeting was scheduled with little notice, just enough time to gather the board and formalize what had already been set in motion. And when Vanessa Whitmore walked into the room, she carried the same composure she had relied on for years, her posture steady, her expression controlled, expecting resistance, perhaps questions, but nothing she hadn't handled before, because in her experience, authority didn't disappear overnight. It was reinforced in moments like this. The discussion began routinely, performance summaries, strategic concerns, the usual language that masks tension without addressing it directly. And Vanessa responded with confidence, outlining plans, reinforcing decisions, maintaining the tone of someone still firmly in control. But as the conversation shifted, the structure began to change. Questions became statements, statements became conclusions, and one by one, the support she expected didn't follow. It was gradual at first, subtle enough that it could have been dismissed, until the point where it couldn't, until the room itself felt different, no longer aligned, no longer responsive in the way she was used to. And then the final piece was introduced, not as a surprise to everyone, but as a confirmation of what had already been decided. Ethan Cole now held the controlling stake in Whitmore and Company, and with it, the authority to redefine its leadership. There was no raised voice, no dramatic interruption, just a shift in position that carried more weight than any argument. And for the first time, Vanessa didn't respond immediately, because the framework she had relied on, the structure that had supported her decisions, had already moved beyond her reach, and within minutes, the outcome was formalized. Her position as CEO terminated, effective immediately. Her role reduced to a title that no longer carried influence. In less than 2 weeks, the woman who once controlled everything found herself outside the structure she had built, not through public scandal or visible collapse, but through a series of decisions she never saw forming. And while the official statements framed it as a transition, as a strategic realignment, the reality was clear to anyone who understood how these moments worked. Control had changed hands, and it wasn't coming back. For Vanessa, the experience wasn't loud. It didn't unfold in front of cameras or headlines in the way people often expect, but there was a different kind of exposure in it, one that mirrored something far simpler, far more personal, the loss of control in a moment where response doesn't change outcome, where standing in place becomes the only option left, and in that sense, the contrast was complete. The same kind of stillness Emma Carter had been forced into days earlier, now reflected in a different setting, under different circumstances. Emma's life, however, had already begun to move in another direction, not suddenly, not in a way that felt unrealistic, but through opportunities that carried intention, a new position offered within the same building, one that placed her in an environment where she was seen, where her work wasn't just expected but acknowledged, and when the offer came, it wasn't presented as charity, it was structured as advancement, something she had earned through the consistency she had always shown. Her first real conversation with Ethan happened after that transition, not as an introduction to power, but as a continuation of something that had already started, a recognition that didn't rely on explanation. And as they spoke, there was no imbalance in the way he approached her, no attempt to position himself as someone above her circumstances, because what had drawn his attention in the first place wasn't weakness. It was control, the kind that doesn't depend on status. He didn't fall for her because she was vulnerable. He fell for her because she never broke, because in a moment where most people would have reacted, she chose restraint, and in a world where power often announces itself loudly, that kind of quiet strength stood out in a way he couldn't ignore, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole made a decision that wasn't just about outcome, but about something far more personal. One moment of arrogance, brief enough to be forgotten, small enough to be dismissed, and yet it carried further than anyone involved could have expected, not because it was loud, not because it demanded attention, but because it revealed something real, something that couldn't be hidden behind status or routine. And in that single moment, 3 different paths began to shift without any of them realizing it at the time. One act of cruelty, delivered without hesitation, without consequence in the moment, the kind that often passes through life unnoticed, leaving no record, no response, no reason to revisit it. And for years, that had been enough, because when no one challenges it, behavior like that continues, unchecked, unexamined, and often repeated, until eventually, it meets a situation it wasn't prepared for. Everything that followed didn't come from anger, it didn't unfold as retaliation, and it didn't rely on confrontation. It moved quietly, shaped by observation, by understanding, by timing, and by someone who had spent years learning that real influence doesn't need to announce itself to be effective. It simply needs to act at the right moment, in the right place, with the right intention. Because this wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about correcting a single action with another, it was about recognizing what that action represented, what it revealed about character, about leadership, about the way power is used when no one is paying attention, and deciding whether that kind of behavior should continue without consequence, or whether it should be met with something stronger than reaction. Someone was watching that morning, not just seeing what happened, but understanding it, measuring it against everything else they knew, and choosing not to ignore it, choosing to respond in a way that extended far beyond that street, far beyond that moment, and in doing so, changed outcomes that had once seemed fixed. And when everything settled, when positions had shifted, when roles had been redefined, and when the noise of it all had faded, what remained wasn't just the result, it was the question that comes with it, the one that doesn't have a simple answer, the one that depends entirely on perspective. If you had that kind of power, the kind that allows you to influence outcomes without being seen, the kind that can change someone's direction without direct confrontation, would you have done the same, or would you have let that moment pass like everyone else did? What do you think? Was what Ethan Cole did justice, a response shaped by principle and timing? Or was it something more calculated, a decision built on opportunity and control that just happened to begin with a moment most people would have ignored? And when you look at how everything unfolded, where do you draw that line between intention and outcome? And if you place yourself in Emma Carter's position, standing there in that moment with no control over what just happened, no one stepping in, no reason to expect anything to change, would you have handled it the same way, with that same restraint, that same focus on moving forward instead of reacting, or would that moment have stayed with you in a different way? Because stories like this don't end when the situation changes. They stay with you in the questions they leave behind, in the choices you imagine making if the roles were reversed, and in the realization that sometimes the smallest moments carry the largest consequences. Subscribe for more real stories where one moment changes everything, because the next one might be even more shocking.